Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote Notes from Underground in 1864, which is considered to be one of the first existentialist works, emphasizing the importance of freedom, responsibility, and individuality. It is an extraordinary piece of literature, social critique, and satire of the Russian nihilist movement, as well as a novel with deep psychological insights on the nature of man. It is no wonder that Nietzsche wrote, Dostoevsky, the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn. He ranks amongst the most beautiful strokes of fortune in my life. Dostoevsky's most sustained and spirited attack on the Russian nihilist movement is voiced by one of the darkest, least sympathetic of all his characters, the nameless narrator and protagonist known as the Underground Man, revealing the hopeless dilemmas in which he lands as a result. Notes from Underground attempts to warn people of several ideas that were gaining ground in the 1860s, including moral and political nihilism, rational egoism, determinism, utilitarianism, utopianism, atheism, and what would become communism. As we'll see, many of these themes are alluded to in the novel. But before delving into Notes from Underground, we must first observe the historical context in which it was written, in order to better understand Dostoevsky's warning. In 1862, Ivan Turgenev published one of the most acclaimed Russian novels of the century, Fathers and Sons, where the characters talk about a strange new philosophy called nihilism, which became popular with the Russian youth. It had previously been synonymous with skepticism, which transformed into moral and political nihilism. A nihilist is a man who does not bow down before any authority, who does not take any principle on faith, whatever reverence that principle may be enshrined in. The nihilist characters define themselves as those who deny everything, representing the negation of all pre-existing ideals. Rational egoism emerged as the dominant social philosophy of the Russian nihilist movement, proposing that we are only rational if we maximize our own self-interest, sharing similarities with utilitarianism, which seeks to maximize utility, such as well-being or happiness, for all individuals. Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, actually came up with a mathematical formula to calculate happiness called the hedonic calculus, to measure the amount of pleasure and pain any given action would result in order to predict human behavior merely by rationality. Dostoevsky saw the rise of rational egoism as a genuine danger, because by glorifying the self, it could turn the minds of impressionable young people away from sound values and push them in the direction of a true, immoral, destructive egoism. The following line perfectly captures this mindset. I say let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea. After his trip around Europe, Dostoevsky wrote that what predominates in the Western culture is a principle of individuality, a principle of isolation, intense self-preservation, of personal egoism, self-definition in terms of one's own I, in placing this I in opposition to all nature and all other people, as an autonomous, independent principle, completely equal and equally valuable to everything that exists outside it. In contrast to this, Dostoevsky calls for a return to the soil, emphasizing the value of family, religion, personal responsibility, and brotherly love, in which each individual feels himself a part of all and is ready to sacrifice himself for the other. Dostoevsky champions this conscious self-sacrifice, which cannot spring from any calculations of self-interest. The underground man is under the influence of egoistic individualism, considering himself as an educated man, a modern intellectual who has lost all capacity for selfless moral feeling. As he writes in the footnote appended to the title of his novel, both the author of the notes and the notes themselves are, of course, fictitious. Nevertheless, such persons as the author of such memoirs not only may, but must exist in our society if we take into consideration the circumstances which led to the formation of our society. Notes from Underground was written as a response to the spokesman of Russian radicals, Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who wrote a novel entitled What Is to Be Done in 1863. In the novel, he shares Rousseau's idea that despite man's flaws, he is innately good and amenable to reason, but is somehow corrupted by society. so that, once enlightened as to his true interests, reason and science would ultimately enable him to construct a perfect society. That is, a society created out of sheer rational calculations of self-interest, would lose the very possibility of doing evil. Thus, rational egoism is the basis for the development of a utopian society. Their dream is to build a well-ordered society for predictably acting human beings. This utopia is symbolized by the Crystal Palace, which represents the quintessential achievement of humanity, where all problems will be solved. Dostoevsky writes that if we all followed the radical socialist way, we could turn society into a crystal palace. He also proposed a belief in absolute determinism or lack of free will, which Dostoevsky brilliantly criticizes with his Underground Man. In Dostoevsky's novel, while talking about the greatness of rational egoism, one of the characters asks rhetorically, "Do you hear that in your underground hole?" 1 year later, Dostoevsky published Notes from Underground. Dostoevsky believed that man was innately rational, capricious and destructive, and not reason but only faith in Christ could ever succeed in helping him to master the chaos of his impulses. Atheism was on the rise, and Dostoevsky saw this as disastrous for society, emphasizing the necessity of belief in Christ. After his death, what he had warned us against had become a reality, foreseeing the rise of the totalitarian state, which he also discusses in his novel Demons, an allegory of the catastrophic consequences of political and moral nihilism that were becoming prevalent in his time. The ideology of Marx gave way to communism, implemented by Lenin and Stalin, making people believe that it was possible to create a perfect society without God, a golden age, where everything is provided in abundance and equally for everyone, eliminating suffering once and for all. The totalitarian states ended up justifying murder in the name of their ideology, leading to the bloodshed of the 20th century. Unfortunately, we have not learned from our mistakes. As Hegel wrote, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. Today we are plagued with a mass mania in the West, where crimes against humanity are hidden under the often attractive cloaks of progress, attempting again to create a utopia. The Underground Man is the quintessential anti-hero, a bitter, lonely, and self-hating 40-year-old retired civil servant living underground, or as in the original Russian text, in a sort of crawl space not big enough for a human and where bugs and rodents roam. This explains why he calls himself a mouse. Here he has been staying for years, listening to people through a crack under the floor, writing these notes from underground. However, the underground can be best seen as a metaphor, representing his profound alienation from society. He lives locked away underground, and these are his confessions. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe my liver's diseased. No, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite. That you probably will not understand. My liver's bad. Well, let it get worse. We are introduced to the strange behavior and psychological distress of the Underground Man right from the start. He calls himself sick, then spiteful, then unattractive, and finally says that he has a liver problem. He is constantly revising himself in order to please his imaginary audience, but is unable to characterize himself properly. We can see, however, that he's not acting to promote his own best interests as dictated by rational egoism. He writes, "In reality, I never could become spiteful. I was conscious every moment in myself of many, very many elements absolutely opposite to that. I knew that they had been swarming in me all my life and craving some outlet from me, but I